for Board Engagement. My name is Kathy Horgan, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. We're actually just going to hold off just 2 or 3 minutes to make sure that everybody's got a chance to log on to the system. We've got quite a few attendees that are joining the session even as we speak. So we'll be right back on in just a couple of minutes. And thank you, and welcome to the webinar. Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to Martin Lundy's webinar regarding strategies for board engagement. My name is Kathy Horgan, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we begin the presentation, I just want to go over a few housekeeping details. We have a large group with us today, so we're actually going to keep everyone on mute so we can avoid background noises and optimize everybody's ability to hear our presenters, but we do want to hear from you. We would ask that you would share your thoughts and questions using the question box that you should be able to see on your screen along the right-hand side. I'm going to be watching that box and seeing what comes in, and we'll be facilitating a Q&A session with the panelists towards the end of the program. We also have Martin Lundy's IT administrator, Tina Purgai, on the call, and she's also going to be watching the question box for any technical issues you might have, and she'll help you with those. We are recording today's web seminar, and we will be sending you a link to the recording as soon as it's available, which is typically by the end of the week you should have that. And also, within the next day, you're going to be receiving an email which includes a copy of the slides, as well as a very brief survey asking you to weigh in on just a few of the questions related to the 3 main topic areas we're covering today. So we ask that you please take a moment to complete the survey, and the answers to that survey are actually going to help inform some of our future thinking in a blog post, and we'll report back to you and aggregate the responses to those. Lastly, please check your handouts area, again on the right-hand side of your screen, which includes a handout with all of the biographic detail of our presenters today, so you can see their biographies and work history. So, with all of that said, I am pleased to be here today with David Gillig, Rebecca Gervin-Argon, and Tina Donahue to talk about a topic that is common and critical for all of us, which is how do we drive more board engagement and investment? My colleagues are going to be discussing how to engage boards in big ideas for your organization, your mission, and also the next generation of key stakeholders for your organization. So let's kick things off. I'm going to turn over the presentation to my colleague, David Gillig, who's going to lead off the discussion with setting a little bit of the scene for the presentation and a discussion of engaging boards in big ideas.
Thank you, Kathy, and greetings, everyone. I join Kathy and my colleagues in welcoming all of you. So this is really an important topic. It's evidenced in the work that we do, our experience in working with clients, but it's also become quite prominent through several studies we've completed and worked on over a number of years. Martz and Lundy has been engaged in looking at this issue actually on multiple fronts. We worked with the American Public Garden Association to conduct 3 different studies spanning 12 years to understand giving among public gardens and the impact of board engagement in fundraising. We've also examined board giving and engagement in 2 surveys of New York City nonprofit organizations, and we've documented best practices in engaging volunteer leadership in developing transformational gift ideas and transformational gifts with children's hospitals. What we know from our studies is that boards comprise about 15 to 46% of total giving in the studies that we've done, depending on the organization's operating budget size. We've also identified that organizations with smaller budgets tend to rely even more heavily on giving from board members. So this is really a critical issue to the work that we all do, and we want to, at Martz and Lundy, keep advancing the dialogue about it. Today we're going to hear about 3 primary topics. One is how we engage our boards in big ideas to recruit and retain outstanding volunteer leaders, how we're going to engage our boards in our missions, and then also how we engage boards of the future, in particular how we engage the next generation involvement and how we can energize and inspire them to be involved at very high levels. We're also going to share some real-life examples as we go through today's presentation. So what does our experience show us? Well, number one, we know that board members are not necessarily going to join our boards because they love to fundraise. In my 35 years of involvement in nonprofit philanthropy, I can't recall a time where a board member said to me or to any of my clients or anyone I know in the profession, boy, I really want to join your board because I love to fundraise. That's why I want to join your board. Board members join because of the attraction to our mission and our programs. That's their primary motivation for becoming involved with us. There are some wonderful exceptions of those board members who really do find a passion and a joy in fundraising, but most board members would much rather be on the giving side than be involved on the getting side in the business of philanthropy. So as we engage board members in how we ask them to be involved in fundraising, we need to understand that most of them are going to participate at worst unwillingly and at best oftentimes hesitantly, that they are somewhat hesitant to become involved in philanthropy. They may feel obligated, but they're hesitant to be involved in fundraising. And in fact, there are some organizations that we know that have said to board members that it is not a responsibility to fundraise. So board members will engage in fundraising really solely on their own terms. we believe that there are ways to engage them in a manner that they can be effective and opportunities that will be joy-filled for them. They can be meaningful opportunities. And we have an opportunity, I think, to talk about some of those today as we walk through today's presentation. So when we define fundraising engagement, we're going to define it today by these two definitions. One is that they're actively involved in the fundraising function of our institution, either helping develop an idea for a gift, the case for support, being involved in the very early stages of a major gift, prospect identification, opening doors, cultivation, solicitation, being involved with our events, being involved in stewardship, being involved in the fundraising process itself. The second is that they are donors, that they give at least annually and that they are giving to our campaigns at a sacrificial level. We probably could all say that we typically hope our board members during their tenure will make our organizations one of their top philanthropic priorities. So let's start by talking about the role of big ideas and the power of big ideas when we look to engage board members, not only from the standpoint of those board members that are already on our boards, but those that we wish to attract. The main point that I'd like to make here is that we are all trying to attract and retain outstanding volunteer leaders in a highly competitive environment. Today's climate is one for the battle of hearts and minds for the best and brightest to serve on our boards. The best are busy, they're connected, they're highly sought after. Sometimes they're serving on multiple boards. So how do we rise above the noise, all of the activity that's out there to try to engage these outstanding trustees, either those who are serving on our board already or those we wish to invite to serve? How do we become one of the most compelling organizations and most compelling boards in our region, in our service area? Well, the first thing I would tell you is what we cannot do, which will not work, and that is to invite people to be leaders to help continue our important work, to continue what we're already doing. It does little to inspire and motivate, and in fact does little to compete well against those organizations that are proposing big ideas and bold visions to do something new, to have greater impact. The big ideas and the bold visions that are presented to attract outstanding leaders are increasingly important, especially those that can be easily translated into impact. So when we think about this, one way that I would propose we think about it is to contemplate the types of questions a prospective or current trustee might ask of us as we ask them to be involved. They may ask very well, what problem are you trying to solve? How important is it? How many people does it affect? Why is it important now? What is the urgency around it? Why does this organization, our organization, why is it the best organization to bring solutions to solve big problems? What strengths do we have? Are we willing to collaborate? Can we be a leader in solving a problem in a collaborative process? And then why should that particular trustee, prospective or current, invest time and talent and resources to be involved? Is there a connection between what we propose to do and what their passions and their hearts are? And then what will be the impact? If we do what we propose to do, can we identify what that impact will be, and can we measure it? Can we really show movement? Can we move the needle forward dramatically as a result of fulfilling the vision? One comment about impact as well. What we found increasingly is that impact, the very idea of impact, is becoming very, very important. The idea of being able to measure it, how fast can it occur, and what difference will exist as a result of that impact. You're going to hear more about that, in particular from my colleague Tina Donahue, in a few moments. So one of the things that I want to just talk about briefly is this idea of risk tolerance and abatement when it comes to big ideas. It's easy enough for me to say to all of you today that you need to develop very big ideas to attract and retain great volunteer leaders. The reality is that I know many of your organizations rely on philanthropy to continue your mission you already are you've already undertaken, and you do not have large reserves and endowments. And in some cases, you have reduced or flat conventional funding streams and rely on philanthropy to continue the mission that you already have underway. I understand that, and so I want to propose that there are ways to think about this that may make sense as you think about big ideas. One is to assess your risk tolerance. We know that there can be a risk of mission expansion, often called mission creep, when we think about new or big ideas. We know that there can be a risk financially to taking away from what is needed for operating support or current capital support to other ideas that would expand mission. And there's the risk, of course, for potential for success or failure. What we found in some of the studies we've done for those with those organizations that undertake very large, big, bold ideas is that there are some strategies and tactics for reducing risk that can really be important for advancing ideas forward. One is to make sure that those ideas have an opportunity to cover existing overhead. And secondly is to have discipline about how much is needed to start an initiative. In other words, if there's a very large idea, bold vision that will cost $30 million, $10 million, whatever the dollar amount may be, there should be discipline around the idea of not starting that idea, initiative, until some dollar amount, majority of those dollars are raised. In other words, we're not going to piecemeal it at $100,000 at a time. We're going to wait until we get to a point where we have enough money to ensure that we can do what's needed to be done to increase the prospects of success. And then finally, to include in your case for support and your giving opportunities on endowment of ongoing funding for whatever idea it may be. These are some of the ideas that we found as we talk to organizations that take on big, bold ideas. And some of this is more detailed if you'd like to look at it in the report that we did for children's hospitals at Transformational Gift Idea Development. So I'd like to now talk about a couple of examples that I think may be important to think about as it relates to your organization and how big ideas can matter when engaging volunteer leaders. This was an organization, a very large organization in a very large U.S. city, a health agency, health services agency, that in which I had a conversation with them at their invitation to talk about building a highly influential board of trustees who will both be involved in giving generously and then being very active in philanthropy development. As we walked through the conversation, a couple of things came out that were very important. Number one, the number of clients they were serving had been flat to downward trending for more than a decade. The impact of their services, however, had been and still could be profoundly important in people's lives. But their brand caused some confusion, even pushed some people who needed their services away from them. So the result of some of these facts and they came to the conclusion that one of the things they needed to do was upgrade board giving and upgrade board fundraising. But as we walked through the conversation, we started asking those big questions that I mentioned a little earlier about what would potential board members and current board members ask of us? Like, why should someone make a gift to our organization or serve on our board? Why should they serve now or give now? What would be different if they served, or what would be different if they gave now? If money was not an obstacle, what could be done to profoundly and permanently change the lives of more people who need help, the kind of help that this agency can provide? And then finally, are we as an organization willing to invite new visionaries and philanthropists into a conversation on how to develop a bold new vision and plan first before asking them to give and to go out and fundraise? So the result of this later was they were going to invite people to create a bold vision concept and invite visionary leaders and philanthropists to help develop it into an exciting and actionable plan. In other words, they started with the idea that we need to create a bold vision first that would be compelling and motivating for some of the best and brightest in their region to join them in creating a solution to some of the issues facing the people that they serve. The next example I'd like to share with you is a real-life example and a client that I'm happy to mention today who's on the phone call today. I had permission from them, do have permission from them to share their name. It's San Diego Botanic Garden. And this was a really wonderful result, starting with a conversation and a plan to build a new building, a new facility on the campus of the Botanic Garden to provide education, essentially, and events for the garden. During some discovery conversations with a prospective lead donor, what we found was this particular donor had revealed a very deep passion for educating children about environment, about plants, and about nutrition. And as we talked with them further, the donor became more involved in the conversation and became more involved in developing this new vision and this new message about this building. Rather than just being need for space, it became an opportunity to partner with schools. It became an opportunity to partner with other agencies to provide education about plants, environment, sustainable foods, and conservation. And then finally, the opportunity became impact by improving the local environment and health and well-being of its citizens. And the messaging became very different from what we originally started with. It became one of impact. It became one of engagement of trustees. As a result, this prospective lead donor became the lead donor for the campaign with $1 million gift, and made it a match. And as a result of that, in approximately a little less than 2 years, the garden now is at 81% of goal toward their funding of this needed conservatory on their campus. So these two examples, I hope, provide a little bit of insight into how ideas can be transformative in engaging volunteer leaders in discussions about how they can be involved, about compelling and motivating messages, inviting people to be involved beyond doing what's being done already. What can be done to advance the mission, advance impact overall? And with that, I will conclude, and pleased to introduce my colleague, Rebecca Gervin-Argon, to take us to the next section.
Rebecca, I just want to make sure that your phone isn't on mute. We're not hearing you right at this moment.
Well, thank you for pointing that out to me. Thank you, David. I'm going to talk a bit about board engagement in mission and board leadership. David's comments really emphasize the big ideas. I think we can't, on a daily basis or weekly basis or monthly basis, have too many new big ideas for our organizations, but we can, I think, very routinely, practically, and competently focus on engaging board members in a way that really connects them to mission and to the work of our organizations. So the statement on this slide basically says, you know, we know if they're involved, they're more likely to be engaged in fundraising. I think that's an assumption we make. I don't know that we have verifiable truth, but based on my 30 years in working in nonprofits and what David and other colleagues talk about, I think it's fairly true that if people are passionate about the work you're doing, they are more willing to take on the challenge of fundraising for you. So why don't we get them more involved? I think sometimes our organizations are simply in a big hurry. It's hard to take the time to put a small committee together or ask a board member to review a new planning document or take the time to bring them in to the decision-making processes that we're used to comfortably making together. There are also times when, quite honestly, we think we have the answers. Maybe the work is quite technical in nature. We have the experts on our staffs. We believe that we've got the answer and we'll kind of let the world know it. And sometimes our CEOs and and/or program leaders simply lack experience in working with volunteers. We can help on multiple levels. We can model the behavior we'd like to see by involving board members in planning and decision-making for fundraising. That can set an important example for the organization. We can be internal advocates for volunteer engagement on many levels, whether it's at a grassroots level, working in the garden, on the board, on an auxiliary committee. We know that volunteer engagement is really very directly related to giving, and in fact, I was looking today at the U.S. Trust High Net Worth study, the most recent one, and the number of high net worth individuals who volunteer is well into the 80% percentile. So we know that that kind of engagement is meaningful for people. The other thing we can do is share examples from other organizations. Benchmarking data can really help to get an organization's attention. Finally, we can really push for board and board committee meetings to offer truly rich learning opportunities. And just like all of us learn in different styles, so do our board members. To me, a great board meeting is one where board members are doing more talking than listening. They're not just a series of reports. Board members are making real decisions, not just rubber stamping hours. And board members are creatively helping to problem solve. We're really calling on their time, talent, and treasure, their creative, managerial, and leadership abilities. I'm sure most of you use the sorts of tools mentioned here and engagement strategies with your board. Part of the challenge for us is how do we take them from the routine to the sublime? How do we take them from something where it's another board meeting to something where the board member goes to a cocktail party and talks about the experience or goes home over dinner and relates stories about it? One of the best meetings that I ever went to was one where art objects, and these weren't, the world's greatest treasures, but they were actual objects of art that were part of a museum collection, and copies of those objects were passed around. The curator led an in-depth discussion about connoisseurship and collecting, about how to tell an original piece of sculpture from a fake. It really heightened the engagement of board members there to be able to touch these objects, to look at shading and light and size and feel the heft of things. It also was fun to think about how hard it was to tell an original from a good copy. I know that that event, that meeting, produced a number of cocktail party conversations, and it was a lot of fun. Another example was with a group of Chicago board leaders at a conservation organization. These leaders met with a group of Brazilian leaders and government representatives to review a possible partnership. The conversation ranged from sustainable grasslands to details of the Memo of Understanding, and it ended up with rounds of drinks over dinner. Interaction with other leaders who cared about the same issue was really stimulating for the board members who were there. And these activities really brought board members closer to the heart of the organization, closer to the staff, and closer to each other. It was a terrific experience to have shared, and then led to some trips to Brazil, some funding of Brazil, a host of interactions with people across oceans that was very rewarding. As board members become more engaged in mission, they're more likely to care enough that they won't say no to our fundraising request. Of course, we can also make that even more likely by tailoring our requests for help to the personal time and talents that they bring. Some may be willing to host an event at home, while others are only willing to make a corporate call. In the New York study that David referenced earlier, the 5 most common activities were providing names, chairing an event, personally making an introduction, hosting an event in their home or club, and asking associates to give. So I think one of the things that I often talk with clients about is how our donors and volunteers' experiences are shaped not only by the work and activity that we undertake with them, but by their other philanthropic involvements and charities. So it's good to know what others are asking them to do, sometimes good to know how we can be different and make it a little more engaging and fun. One of the trends that we're seeing more and more is that very busy people want a specific assignment and may be interested in something like a time-limited task force, something where the impact can be seen in a short period of time and where they're clear that they have to go to 3 meetings and then that's it. So we said we'd share some examples today, and I'm going to give yet another example from conservation work. This was a national conservation organization that undertook a very large land acquisition project to convert a 7,000-acre farm to a restored wetland. And this particular board member was deeply interested in conservation, but wetlands weren't really her thing. There were other habitat types and environments that were more of interest to her. However, she did lend her support. She was a great board member because of the scope and scale of the project. And this wetland, once converted, was going to be used for educational purposes. People would hunt and fish there, recreational purposes, school children, various scientific studies. It really was a very important resource for the conservation community in a large regional area, as well as for the local communities. As the project progressed, it became clear that a visitor master plan was essential. The organization really needed to think about things like where people would park, how they were going to orient visitors, where some simple kiosks could go up. There was no plan for a big building, but there needed to be some sort of visitor center or welcoming area. As it turned out, the trustee's daughter was a trained landscape architect, and the mother reached out to the daughter and asked her to help us design a charrette process to select the landscape architect. A small committee of board and staff worked together, interviewed 3 or 4 architects and their firms over a period of 2 days, and a plan was then developed for a naturalistic visitor center. After 2 full days of meetings in central Illinois, part of me thought, oh, the folks are really going to be ready to get home. And of course they were, but I can tell you they really loved it. They loved being part of the process. There was a good balance in the decision making. And the center ended up being funded by the trustee and her family foundation. And it's an important resource in the community that it serves. One last example before I wrap up involves a botanical garden. And this was an auxiliary board that demonstrated a very early interest in aquatic plants. Members of this board started collecting aquatic plants. They were growing them in their own gardens. They also started selling them at their annual plant sale. It so happened that this garden had several adjacent lakes, but they were unattractive and undeveloped at that point in time. I mean, the garden had really focused on its own land-based plant collections, and there really was not a lot of focus on the water, even though it was a fairly dominant feature. But over time, the CEO and other program leaders began to envision a very different approach to the water systems at the garden. And they worked to involve this auxiliary board in planning and fundraising committees that oversaw shoreline restoration, naturalistic plantings of aquatic plants, and the development of new lakeside gardens. The auxiliary board ended up providing, of course with our encouragement, the first named endowed curatorship at this garden, and it was in aquatic plants. Of course, with that expertise on board and the drive of that very talented curator, the garden continued to develop its aquatic focus, including new aquatic gardens in some of the large lakes, and the auxiliary board funded those as well. So it was a long-term, probably a decade-long partnership that goes on, as far as I know, to this day. So as you engage the hearts and minds of board members, we know that you also need to employ specific strategies to help encourage their activities. Some of those that we have seen work well, again, are mentioned in our New York board studies. One of the things that is so important, I think, is CEO and board leadership expectations. If your CEO is supportive of engagement, it's going to get you down the road you need to walk much faster, obviously. And if key trustees are modeling the behavior, others will follow. Peers are such incredible influencers. I'm sure you've all had this happen where one board member looks at another and says, boy, you set the bar higher for us. So important to get the leaders on your side and ask them to help you recruit others. Sometimes a local community foundation or leading foundation or corporation also will help to elevate the dialogue and philanthropic action in the community. I saw this with a client recently in the middle of the country where a couple local foundations are really working to help create more of a climate for individual giving. Board members also will sometimes tell you they're really not interested in philanthropic training or coaching. However, I will say that usually when I've done it with boards, they are grateful that they've had it. There's some information that they didn't have. They feel more comfortable if some of the language you give them is helpful and sets a model out for them in terms of how they talk about fundraising. And finally, obviously, our strong staff planning and follow-up is so important. There is no more valued or influential constituency group for a nonprofit organization than its board of directors. So when a board member says to me, I haven't heard from someone yet, that's always a clue that we need to encourage staff to remember that the first call they return is that call from a board member. Well, thanks very much, and I'm delighted to now turn the presentation to my colleague Tina Donahue, who's going to talk a bit about engaging younger leaders.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you, David. As we round out our discussion on strategies for board engagement, we felt it was also important to mention some of the trends we're seeing among next generation stakeholders. What may be surprising is that while some approaches to engaging these younger donors may feel new, many are tried and true strategies that have worked well with all generations of donors. The next generation of major philanthropists, those who fall into the Gen X and Gen Y categories, born between 1965 and 1995, are expected to have tremendous influence on the direction of and support for efforts to improve local communities and solve global problems over the next several decades. You know, we're already starting to see some of this impact in terms of giving. The slides you see on your screen show the findings from a study that Blackbaud conducted in 2013. The study segments donors into 4 groups based on their age. The top left-hand quadrant represents the mature groups in the 70-plus age range, while the group in the lower right-hand quadrant represents the millennials, or the Generation Y. The big takeaway from this study is that younger generations, the Gen X and Gen Y in general, are philanthropic. Approximately 60% give. They give to multiple charities, at least 3 or more. And while their gifts are not as large as what you see in the top quadrant, amongst the maturers and the baby boomers, the trends suggest their gifts will steadily rise over time. For these reasons and more, we are seeing an increased focus on younger donors and trying to understand how we engage them and excite them about the mission and involve them in meaningful ways in our organizations. So let's now talk about some approaches for engaging and inspiring these next generation donors. While some strategies may look familiar, there is a notable shift in the expectations among the younger generation regarding their own level of involvement and desire for information. The first is something that David briefly talked about, was this focus on impact. And we're not talking just, just the typical impact. It's immediate. Young donors are looking for ways to be a catalyst for immediate changes, and they want to be shown how their own involvement has contributed to the bottom line. And from a board perspective, what that means is, yes, they need to be educated about the value and importance of serving on the board, but they also really want to understand how their time and their talents can make a real tangible difference. So it's not just about writing a check or receiving a plaque. The research suggests that younger donors are concerned more about hands-on involvement and impact and less so about recognition. They are also looking for measurements and accountability of that impact and to be stewarded. Just a recent example, I was at a dinner party this weekend and I was sitting next to a Gen Xer. And after she found out I was in fundraising, she spent an hour talking about the charities in town where she was a major donor and how she was so disappointed that after she made large gifts, the organizations just either stopped talking to her or, in a place where she was one of the founding members, put her in the back of the room at an event. Why I'm telling you this story is what resonated with me was that while the idea about accountability and stewardship cut across all generations of donors, it appears that younger generations are expecting a higher level of sophistication through technology to provide more personalized approaches and immediate communication of the results. Another strategy that we've kind of mentioned today too is to provide specific examples of how these younger donors can help. So instead of just asking someone to join the board, be specific about that request. For example, if you have somebody who has a digital marketing background, ask them to chair the social media task force to improve awareness and raise additional funding for the organization. Younger generations want to be involved but feel short on time, so they want to know why you want them to join and what specific talents and tasks they can bring to the table. Also, Rebecca mentioned and made some really great points on this next item, which is experiential learning opportunities. So I won't spend too much time here other than to reiterate how these experiential learning opportunities are critical ways to turn what is discussed in board meetings, the abstract, if you will, into concrete meaning for the board member by providing face-to-face experiences with the recipients of their philanthropy. This is something that has worked for earlier generations of donors and appears to be extremely critical for the next gen as well. Another opportunity, way to engage the next generation of donors, and this is where I feel like the next gen is really placing a lot of emphasis on, is learning about philanthropy through their networks and using these multi-channel opportunities to engage this next gen. Recent study I read was that 91% of next-gen donors say they search for information about an organization on their website. So really important to keep that messaging up to date and clear. Also, donors, including those in the baby boom and X generations, are involving children and family giving and volunteering at younger ages than previous generations. Today, you see many parents and adults, including both children and young adults, in philanthropic activities as a way to pass on their personal values, provide shared experiences, establish those traditions, and in some cases prepare children to manage the family's philanthropy one day. Just to give you an example, Rebecca and I were just recently talking about one of her clients who for years now have engaged the children of board members early on. And she's commented time and time again how effective that has been for the organization in terms of cultivating that next generation of donor and understanding the mission and the purpose behind the organization. And then the final point here on this item about multi-channel opportunities is peers. The next gen is highly networked with their peers. They learn about causes and get strategies from their peers and are influenced by the behaviors of their peers. For some of the nonprofits I volunteer for here in Austin, it is not uncommon to see these next geners attending each other's favorite charity events. And that's how, and they become really critical influencers in each other's lives. And then finally, take the long view. The initial ROI may be low. Getting them involved through tiered levels of volunteer leadership is one way to engage younger donors in the inner networking of your organization and to have those early on meaningful experiences. It is likely that many will want to do the hands-on work first before writing that check. However, trends suggest that the payoff long-term could be great. Scholars estimate that $59 trillion will transfer as bequest to the post-baby boom generation over the first century, half of the century. So hang on. Now I'd like to just close with a few examples that I wanted to share with you. The first one is actually, it's a client of David's, and he shared with me this recent story about a children's hospital that he had been working with, who had invited a Gen Xer to sit on their board. This person had been a donor and had significant wealth, so it was a logical choice from an organizational standpoint to involve that person on the board. However, from the perspective of the Gen Xer, it was unclear how he could have a meaningful and tangible impact. That was until the Gen Xer was asked his opinion regarding an initiative to rapidly advance research for pediatric diseases for which currently there is no cure. This idea and the challenge to help raise dollars for this noble research sparked an immediate interest with this next-gen philanthropist. He immediately took the reins on this initiative and also offered to get his peers involved. But his perspective was that in order to engage his generation, it would require three things. First, that everyone could participate in developing the initiative. Second, the initiative would have a global view of diseases affecting children and a commitment to innovative approaches and collaborations. And third, the staff would have to provide full and transparent accountability and rapid results. I really thought this example provided some excellent tips from this Gen Xer that could be used by any organization who is trying to engage donors of all generations in their boards. The second example is this quote you see on your screen, and it was something I read in a recent study of the next gen donors. And what is interesting about this quote is the perception by this younger donor about her involvement in philanthropy versus perceptions of older generations. While this younger donor views the older generations as being involved, they see the old guard, if you will, as donating either their money or their time. Whereas the next geners want to work side by side with the organization. They want to be a participant, and they want to be someone who donates not only their money but their time. Okay, well, I really thank you so much for your time. We hope through David's discussion you were able to gain a deeper understanding of how board involvement in forming your organization's biggest ideas can lead to transformative gifts. Rebecca shared some great ideas for connecting your board to the mission and to program-related activities that will help generate more meaningful involvement and giving. And finally, I hope that you learned some new and not so new ways next-gen board members want to be engaged and involved. The strategies for board engagement are the same, but the intensity is greater, we're finding, for younger generations. And that the next generation is asking more in terms of accountability and hands-on experience. And that direct and immediate impact could also be strategies for engaging all generation of donors. I'm going to now turn this back over to our moderator, Kathy Horgan. We'd love to hear what questions are out there and comments you may have about board engagement.
Thank you, David, Tina, and Rebecca. As I mentioned at the outset, for those of you that joined the conversation a little bit later, on your interface for the webinar, there should be a question box. And we would ask if you have any questions for the panelists that you would type them into the question box as opposed to raising your hand. And we actually have a few questions that I'm going to start with. First of all, for David, when you talk about the example, the garden example, someone asked, was that donor already giving to the organization, or how was that donor identified? And
that donor had been giving to the organization, had made annual gifts for a number of years, had made what I would call a special level gift for a specific project, but the gift that they made to be the lead gift donor was many multiples more than they had given in the past. I would just say I think that the biggest motivator for them to give was that the discussion with them was an invitation to have input into what the idea would be that would eventually be funded. They invested in the idea first and invested in the willingness to have a conversation, be involved in a discussion, which led to the eventual gift that they made.
Fabulous, thank you. Another question, Rebecca, I think maybe you can address this one. And the question is, what would be your recommendation for working with board members that initially commit to helping with special initiatives, but then they don't actually have time or don't respond to follow-up from staff?
Well, I think I'd either reach out to them again to simply clarify if something had changed for them and they no longer wanted to be engaged, or had they gotten busy at the office, maybe a child was sick. Always hard to know what's going on with people. I also genuinely find as well that our perception of being pesky is greater than the person on the other side's. So I will sometimes say, I know I've called you several times. I just really wanted to make sure that you knew I was trying to follow up. If this isn't going to work for you at this point, please let me know. But I think it's important to follow up in multiple ways. Some people will respond to email. Some people will respond to a phone call. I think the only thing to do is to talk directly to the person. If it's a very senior level of engagement, obviously you can also ask your board member, a program leader, or your VP of development to make the call. But I would try to follow up multiple times in different ways before I gave up on the situation.
Fabulous. I have a lot of questions. David, can you suggest a balance of old guard and new next generation individuals on a board?
Yeah, I don't know if I could give you a specific ratio, but I would say this. We know that there are people that go through seasons in their lives, and the idea of a legacy season in one's life really does not occur for most young people. They're still raising families. They're still trying to get started or advance in their career, in their finances. They may be more leveraged. Whereas there are people who are of a certain age that they are either retired or close to retirement, and are looking at what impact that they have had and wish to have with the remaining years of their lives, and and what legacy they want to leave. So we want to have both. And those who are in the later parts of their careers where they're really fully leveraged, have great respect and a lot of connection, a lot of gravitas in the community, we want those too. I don't know a ratio other than there's sometimes, I've heard sometimes, well, we need lots more young people. Well, I would say we always want to be looking at bringing young people in, but I would also propose that there's a lot of value to having a balance.
That's great. So we have a series of questions around board expectations, and maybe Rebecca, I'll shoot these your way, but a few of them are, how often are you seeing organizations use explicit contracts with board members around expectations for both the board member and the organization? And a related question is, what about minimum levels of giving for boards and terms for boards? Can you talk a little bit about structuring that sort of expectations around board giving and engagement?
Absolutely, Kathy. And I will say, I will recommend that you go online and look at the surveys that we've done, because I do think there's some very helpful information in both the New York Board study and the Public Gardens study. I don't know that I am seeing a lot, either from my own 30-plus years of experience or in clients' explicit contracts. I do think that formal discussion with every board member about where they want to help, how they'd like to make an impact, what committees they're going to serve on, or what task force they're going to serve on, is very important. And I have seen an organization develop a work plan for board members. That feels to me a little too much work a day. It's kind of like a staff thing almost. I do think that setting clear expectations in a meeting with the chair and the CEO, or perhaps with the development person as well, is really important. And I would try to do that every year with board members, because I do think it helps people think about the fact that they need to make a contribution of their time and talent every year, and the organization really needs them. And people also want to change their involvement over time. If they're involved on a board for, say, they serve 2-3-year terms, they may not want to be on the same committees for 6 years. They might want to switch them up. They might want to do something else because it's an opportunity to work with some additional board members, or learn something new, or get exposed to a different part of the organization. So I strongly recommend an annual meeting with a specific discussion. At a minimum. I think a contract to me sounds like a word that isn't used typically when someone's volunteering, so it's not a word that I would choose to use. In terms of minimum levels of giving, I have frankly preferred not to use minimums myself, because I think they can lower the bar for people who are capable of being extraordinarily generous, and there may be some people who cannot give at the minimal level.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. We are actually at the end of our time, and I have a number of outstanding questions and comments, and I think we're going to want to follow up with those via email, and we promised to get back in touch with those of you that had questions that we weren't able to answer on this webinar. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending along a copy of the slides with a short survey that we would love to get your opinions on, which will also help to inform future content and blog posts around such an important topic. So thank you very much to all of you for attending. Thank you to Rebecca, David, and Tina for a fabulous presentation. And we look forward to continuing the discussion about board giving in the future.